One of the major events in the history of international relations in 20th century is the Cold War. And there is no way one can get rid of the problems of Cold War even in the 21st century. There are several scholars who believe that the Cold War did not start in 1945 at the end of the war, but it started much earlier when the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, had captured power in Russia and turned the old state, the Tsarist state, into Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They believe that the ideological clash between the capitalists and the communists dates back to that day, and they also insist that the fighting between the white forces and the red forces was really the beginning of the Cold War. There was an ostracizing of Russia, the new Russia, by the Western nations. Not that Russia had always been in the mainstream, Russia had always been as a major power on the margins of European international relations. But after the Bolsheviks captured power, I think the Russians were even more marginalized and ostracized systematically. But that is a very, very long story. I think it's much more sensible to focus on 1945 and the changing of the world order. The world order was drastically altered. The advent of nuclear weapons transformed the balance of power into balance of terror. A new kind of a power emerged, which was not a great power, a major power, but a superpower. And there were two contending superpowers, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And these two superpowers represented two different ideological poles, two different kind of mindset, two rival contending modes of production, distribution, organizing polity. And there was the battle for the minds of men to win over in the third world Afro-Asian countries. What is most important is what we call Cold War implies that there was no direct military hostility between these two superpowers. But the rest of the world was suffering traditional ravages of war throughout this period. So Cold War meant a very hot peace for some. Actually, this is the title of a book written by a British scholar who says Cold War, Hot Peace. So there were areas of the world which had brushfire wars, and there were several crises in this period called Cold War. Actually, the word crisis is very interesting. It is very frequently abused in international relations, and I think it's time that we take a close look at it and see what it means. If there is a patient in an emergency ward in a hospital, they say it's a critical care. He is going through a crisis. So what does the crisis mean? It means a dramatic turning point. Either the patient will die or the patient will survive and get back to good health. So in international politics, it means a problem which has reached a point of explosion. So either it would explode and destroy and destruct everything, or it would be somehow or other the explosion would be averted and things would improve. The crisis would be managed. So you normally have two words, crisis management and diffusing of a crisis. But crisis has become a word of common currency in international relations. It dates back to the period of Cold War. So what were the major crises and how did India, recently independent, cope with these crises? The first crisis of certain magnitude was in Korean Peninsula. This was the American general fighting the Japanese had marched onto Korea and reached a certain point in geographical space where the ceasefire took place. And the country was partitioned, like Vietnam was partitioned, like Berlin was partitioned in the European theater, because forces which had occupied the land and the forces which were fighting against the Allied powers gaining to regain the control of their own land, the North Koreans in this case. Where the Cold War ideology entered the picture was that the North Koreans were being helped by the Chinese, the communists, the Maoists, whom the Americans counted as their adversary and enemies, and South Koreans were being helped by the American forces, and which both sides held their ground. So there was this crisis and it continued. And the matter went to the United Nations, and because of the special structure of the United Nations, the veto was repeatedly being used and no progress was being made. I think this is one of those most fantastic diplomatic initiatives which India undertook. It has never been repeated after that because people got wise to it. India bypassed the Security Council. They rallied and advocated the members of the General Assembly, where not the great powers, not the veto holding powers were holding sway, but where the majority of members were Afro-Asians, the new nations, erstwhile colonies, and they passed a Uniting for Peace resolution and an intervention for the restoration of peace and stopping of war could take place. It aroused the ire of the Americans, but it popularized India greatly in the Afro-Asian world because they could see a nation, one of their own, using the United Nations mechanism, using diplomacy creatively and restoring at least partial peace to the Korean Peninsula. The second episode, which was as remarkable, was the Suez Crisis. Now, Colonel Abdul Kamal Nasir was a revolutionary leader. He was an army officer who had succeeded in leading a coup against Shah Farooq, and after Farooq was ousted, a group of young modernizing officers of the Egyptian army had taken over. They were socialistically inclined, they were modernizers, they were looking for inspiration towards Soviet Union. Obviously, they were looked upon as enemies by the Americans. So Nasir was a proud Arab, and he never could understand why the Suez Canal, which passed through his territory, should be controlled by the French. Why should the royalty keep going on to them? Why should they have the monopoly of deciding who can pass, who could not pass? So he nationalized the Suez Canal. And the moment he nationalized the Suez Canal, there was great consternation among the British, amongst the French. They wanted to teach Nasir a lesson. Now, this is where we see the racial memories and we see the historical experience. The Prime Minister of Great Britain at that stage was Anthony Eden. Anthony Eden was an aristocrat. He was a son-in-law of the legendary Prime Minister of England, Winston Churchill, and he was an arch-conservative, aristocrat to boot, disliked colored people, including the Arabs, upstarts. He could have dealt with the king of Egypt, Faisal, but he could not prepare himself to deal as an equal with somebody who was heading the government there, but was a army officer of low rank, a colonel, and who had suddenly been propelled to the highest position. So there are actually anecdotes where his dislike for Nasser is totally illogical and irrational. He says, how can I talk to an upstart? How can I talk to an Arab army officer who knows nothing about statecraft? So that was one prejudice. And the second prejudice was the French were maybe reluctant because they knew how it would work out. Unfortunately, the American Secretary of State then was John Foster Dulles. Now, John Foster Dulles was a very hardcore, devout Christian. He also had another problem. He saw the world in blacks and white. He thought that Americans were on the side of God and everybody else who opposed the Americans was on the side of Satan, a devil. Actually, there's a very nice article in the journal called Foreign Policy written Devil and Mr. Dulles. And Mr. Dulles simplified things. Whoever was not with us was against him. And he also believed that the Arabs should be taught a lesson. If they were not taught a lesson, they would become very cocky, they would become dominant in the Middle East, where the Americans had succeeded at the end of the Second World War, before the war ended, in planting an artificial creation, the cat's paw, the State of Israel, based on religion, created artificially, ousting a large number of Palestinians from their homeland to avenge an injustice which had been perpetrated on them 2000 years ago in biblical times. So if the Jews had been rendered refugees, the idea was not to give them reparation after 2000 years at the cost of the Palestinians who had stayed there for 2000 years. But that is yet another story, very complex, very involved. But here what matters is the American dislike for the Arabs and American support for the Israel gave them the idea, if not the Americans, all of them. Actually, it is brought out in the archive since then that Dwight D. Eisenhower, the President of the United States, that was quite against Dulles' misadventure. Now, the problem is that Dulles was suffering from a very serious terminal illness, a cancer. So was Anthony Eden. It was not known then, but he was under severe pain and under the influence of painkillers. Now, this bits of information is to only let you know and understand that the decisions taken about the reaction to nationalization of Suez Canal was done by two people who were arch conservatives, hawks, and probably were not taking the decision in cold blood. They were under influence of medication, severe pain, and actually they say that Dwight D. Eisenhower allowed John Foster Dulles a free hand because he knew that the old man, his Secretary of State, would not survive for long. The result was disastrous. The Anglo-French military intervention was defeated, and India played a very important role. The India gave diplomatic support wholeheartedly to Colonel Abdul Kamal Nasser, rallied round the rest of the Afroasians against him, and the British could not take on the united might of the senior most member of the Commonwealth going to the side of that. And then there's a very interesting picture which was printed in newspapers those days, that a symbolic machine gun which was used in protection of to fight off the Anglo-French military intervention was called Port Said, and it was given to Nehru by the Arabs. Now, interestingly, Suez again contributed largely to the Indian image building. Korea was the first step. Suez allowed the rest of the world to understand that India may be a new nation, India may be a poor country, India may be struggling to rehabilitate its refugees and take on industrialization, but India had the moral power and the ethical lead to take on the bullies of the world and remain. Nehru had taken a conscious decision to keep India outside the contest, which incidentally is the title of a book written by an Indian political scientist, K.P. Karunakaran, who said that Nehru took a conscious decision to keep India outside the context. Why? Because during the period of Cold War, Nehru realized that peace was of ultimate importance, primary importance to nations like India. Without peace, they could not build up their economy. Without peace, they could not have social justice. Without peace, they could not have communal harmony in the country. Without peace, they could do nothing. So peace was of primary importance. And how did you maintain peace? You tried to resolve conflicts far away from your borders, which could have exacerbated the violence in your neighborhood as well. Violence is an extremely dangerous tendency of traveling very fast, vitiating the atmosphere. So as long as you have ceasefires, as long as you have peaceful settlement of disputes, the chances of an explosive, disastrous conflict or a crisis is not there. So Suez was the second thing. Then came the third thing, which was the conflict in Vietnam. In Vietnam, the French realized, defeated, devastated, economically impoverished, that they could not control their colonies and subjugate them in Southeast Asia. But unfortunately, hubris, racial pride, which we keep talking about, nation states do not always work rationally. The French were also in the quest of glory, their past glory. They were reluctant to. They knew that they were not quite the same great power they were before the war, but twice they had suffered the ravages of war in the First World War, Second World War, but they wanted to retain the glory of their colonial empire. They were reluctant to get rid of Algeria, they were reluctant to get rid of Southeast Asian empire. So the countries in Indochina, Cambodia, Laos and the Vietnams, they tried to reassert their control. Unfortunately for the French, during the period of Japanese occupation, the Vietnamese had been armed and learned how to fight either their Japanese oppressors, or they were naturally inclined because of their great leader Ho Chi Minh, the father of their nation, who was a socialist, Marxist, communist, who had close ties with China, that the Chinese would come to their help. So they started following a model of national liberation, which Mao was doing, of the peasant warfare, of guerrilla warfare, and one guerrilla could tie up 10 regular army people. And the war continued, which the French fought with the Vietnamese till 1954-55, till Bernard Fall has written a very nice book with a very evocative title called Hell in a Very Small Place. So in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French army was routed and they had to move out. But by that time, the Americans had got interested. The Americans were worried that if the French move out, they will create a space in which the communists will move out. They had tried to stop the Chinese in Korea. Thanks to the Indian intervention, the Chinese had retained control, at least their influence over North Korea, while the South Koreans were totally dependent on American protection. But in Vietnam, the Americans thought that if they carried on the fight, which the French were reluctant to carry on, they would stem the tide. We go back once again to Mr. John Foster Dulles. He propounded a very interesting theory called the domino theory. Now, domino is a game played in America, very popular. There are small standalone pillars, kinds of things of wood, and you throw a ball from a distance. The dominoes are arranged in a sort of pattern, and if one domino falls or a skillful player throws a ball in a particular manner, the dominoes fall one after the other. So he had this theory that Southeast Asia and the fight against communists was a game of domino. If one domino fell, the other dominoes would fall. So it was for them of great importance that Vietnam should be not lost to the communists. And there began a war which lasted almost 2 decades, from 54-55 to 1973, when the Americans got bogged down in the quagmire of Vietnam and ultimately, without saving their face, had to retreat. But that we are jumping forward in the story. In Cold War period, immediately steps were taken that the non-aligned nations should see to it that not undue damage is inflicted in this ongoing war. So there was an International Control Commission, of which India was the chairman. Poland and Canada were other members. Now, if you see the composition, it almost reflects the realities of power politics in United Nations. The veto wielding powers were Soviet Union, so they had a nominee, Poland. To balance Poland, they had a so-called independent member on the other side, Canada, which was obviously going to be not displeasing the Americans in the commission. So India's role became crucial. So India's chairpersonship in the Vietnam War, during its participation in International Control Commission, again built up India's image during the Cold War period and allowed it to play a role much larger on an international stage than its economic condition, its military power allowed it to do so. This only was thrown out of gear way back in 1965 when the war was going very badly for Americans. Americans suddenly decided to raise up the ante, escalated the war. There were very warmongering doves in America. David Haberstorm has written a very good book about it called The Best and the Brightest. The argument, simply put, is this, that the best and the brightest of brains did not have the wisdom to give up war and follow the path of peace. Whether it was McNamara, whether it was McGeorge Bundy, whether it was Rostow brothers, whether it was anybody else, the generals, nobody had the foresight to see that this was not a war worth fighting because Americans had no vital interest left there. But the legacy of Cold War, the legacy of the domino theory, the legacy of the national honor having been committed there. At the height of the war, the Americans had almost 500,000 American soldiers deployed in the Vietnamese soil. They were using ecological weapons, laying waste their crops and trees and antifoliants. The cancer-producing agent orange was being used. Napalm bombs were burning and scalding the Vietnamese children. So they were trying to deny the sanctuaries in jungles to these, so jungles were destroyed. Centuries-old waterworks were destroyed. The whole country was devastated. Why? The Americans could not bear the thought of withdrawing and facing humiliation. But then, by that time, India could not play a very concrete role in the International Control Commission because India was going through a bad patch itself. After Nehru's death, after the war with China, the border war, a short interregnum when Shastriji ruled and Pakistan imposed another war on India, which India acquitted itself very well, but Mrs. Gandhi took over power. And the country was having severe shortages of food grains. It was dependent on American food grain imports, which are called PL 480, Public Law 480. And the Americans were in a position to humiliate India repeatedly by saying that as long as we are feeding you, you can't possibly take up a stance in international relations, which was against us. We must remember with gratitude that Mrs. Gandhi, she might have made many more mistakes in subsequent years or even before that, but she stood her ground. She could not be bullied down. From 65 to 71, her government was dependent on the support of Communist Party of India. She was dependent for major technological inputs and assistance and the veto of the Soviets in the Security Council to save it from the Americans dragging the Kashmir dispute there. But she maintained the national pride of India and the independence of India and did not let Americans bully her, pressurize her into giving up non-alignment. On the contrary, she steadily drifted towards Soviet Union, drew closer to Palestinians, Yasser Arafat treated her like a sister, she treated Yasser Arafat like a brother, and her support to the Palestinians was unflinching. Those were the days when an Indian passport has a rubber stamp saying not valid for travel in Israel, South Africa, and Portugal. Goa was still occupied by Portugal, so Portugal was out. South Africa was following a policy of apartheid, so Indians, you could travel with special permits, but Israel was a no-no. Now, this is the time when India was economically weak, was facing all kinds of problems after succession of Nehru. There was revolt against Mrs. Gandhi's leadership within her own party, but the policy of non-alignment was not given up. The consensus on foreign policy was maintained, and India continued to follow a role of constructive mediation in all the civil war conflicts. There are two Cold War crises and three civil wars where India could not play a role, and one might briefly have a look at it. One was a major crisis called the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Obviously, India could not play a role in it because the Cuban Missile Crisis coincided with the Sino-Indian border war. And actually, the Chinese keep complaining till this date that the Soviets were so distracted by the Cuban Missile Crisis, they did not come to their aid or support the brothers, the Chinese brothers, and ultimately sided with Indian friends. So the non-socialist friends were proved to be more important than the Chinese socialist friends. That besides the point. India, because it was reeling under the attack by the Chinese, it could not even make routine ritualistic statements about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis, again, was a crisis of a kind where nothing could be done about it. It was a question of who would blink first. Would the Americans blink first or the Russians blink first? First, the Russian diplomat at the United Nations made a claim that there were no Russian missiles in the Cuba, but when the Americans imposed a naval blockade, which is almost an act of war, and whether the satellite pictures were brought down, they had to admit, and they agreed to dismantling the nuclear missile silos. Now, this is the only period when one could say that Indians could not play a role in a distant crisis of this sort. We come to a little later period. In 1969, there was another major development in international politics, in international relations. The Chinese decided that they have had enough of the big brotherly treatment of the Soviet Union, and they decided to say that, look, we will fight for our rights. Mao was in his most irresponsible, excited form. He had launched the great cultural proletarian revolution, which he thought would be a perpetual revolution to keep the revolution pure, and he thought that the Russians were revisionist, they were corrupt, they had given up the path of Marxism, and he brought on a crisis of the border dispute on the Ussuri River in Siberia, and there was a small clash between the Russians and the Chinese, which could be contained. The military hostilities did not increase, but the schism, the gap, the crack between the fissure between the Soviet Union and the Chinese was very clear. So one could say that from that day onward, there was a weakening in the hawkish temper of the Cold War on both sides, because the socialist bloc was weakened, the Chinese had split away, there was a schism, and in Europe, by that time, also there was emergence of Eurocommunism, there was multipolarity, and the European Union was emerging as a powerful alternative of economic activity, of cultural interaction, and if need be, of political assertion. By that time, American President Kennedy had been assassinated, Johnson had taken over, and President Lyndon B. Johnson was talking of the great American dream, getting out of these wars and building America at home. Also, the European allies were resenting American directions, guidance in international politics. They wanted to establish a relationship of their own with changed reformist Russia post-Khrushchev in Look East policy of Willy Brandt. They were looking forward to peace in Middle East, Camp David, between the Israelis and the Arabs, and maybe the peace could be brought. So there was, in English, what they call thaw, a melting of the snow. So if the Cold War was frozen relationships, the thaw brought about a reduction in tensions. And a very happy French word was used for this. It was called détente, is a relaxation in tensions. But did it mean that the Cold War ended? Did it mean that India did not have a role to play? We have some very interesting developments of the Cold War at this stage in this what is normally seen as the second phase of Cold War. And let's see how India reacted to it. Throughout the period of Cold War, India had played a very constructive role in disarmament negotiations. As we noticed, as we have repeatedly said, that the balance of terror was a very frightening thing. People like Bertrand Russell had written books called Has Mankind a Future? People thought that it was madness, and the madness was an acronym, mutually assured destruction. If any nation used an atomic bomb and the other retaliated with it, there was enough built up nuclear arsenal to destroy the whole of mankind, poison the planet, rendered it a wasteland. It was not only the use of atomic weapons, it was the testing of atomic weapons which was also creating a hazard of radioactivity and pollution. And India was one country which wanted peace to be the primacy, and it never wanted the world to go to the brink of nuclear holocaust. So what they did was they initiated a whole lot of negotiations which were disarmament negotiations, which were arms control negotiations. And India played a very critical role in the 18th Nation Disarmament Conference. It talked of control of biological weapons, it talked in terms of chemical weapons, but more important than anything else, it talked in terms of atoms for peace and only peaceful uses of atomic energy. At times, the Indian advice was listened to carefully. At other times, the nations, the atomic powerful weapon ready nations, did not want to listen to Indian voice, but Indians continued to plod on. And what is important once again is to notice that India was not following this policy as narrow pursuit of self-interest or national interest. It knew that it would pay a price for this. It knew that it would not endear itself to Americans. It knew that people would claim it that its non-alignment was opportunism because it wanted to receive aid from both sides. But Indians carried on this. And for Indians, it was a matter of some satisfaction when in the 1970s, the world reached a stage where there was some kind of an accommodation between the strategic arms limitation talks and between Russians and the Americans, and there was some kind of an agreement that the world should move back from nuclear weapons to some kind of hotline negotiations and never let another crisis like the Cuban missiles come. Both sides worked on it. The Russian side worked on it and the American side worked on it. But what happened was that there was a normalization of relationship, more or less, between the Soviet Union and the Americans. At the same time, after the Americans withdrew from the Vietnamese quagmire, they wanted to reduce the tension in their relationship with Maoist China, and so Kissinger and Nixon worked about a renegotiation of relationship with China. Once this happened, the détente was very real. Tension had really reduced. Russians and Americans were talking to each other with a certain degree of trust, not entirely, but certain measure of trust, not distrusting each other totally. It was not like the spy who came in from the cold and everything in the realm of cloaks and dagger, everything in realm of trying to have propaganda to demonize the opponent. Same thing was happening to China, that America was opening up to the possibilities of dealing with China in coming years. That left India in a very tricky situation. India's diplomacy and India's foreign policy had been geared all these years to play the role of an honest broker, to be the voice of sanity, and to keep the warring factions apart. If the Americans and the Russians come together, if the Chinese and the Americans come together, and if the Russians and the Chinese get over the lacerations of 1969 Ussuri River clashes, then where does that leave India? Now, that is something which we must realize, that India had to wait for a short while before the Second Cold War started. This détente, this reduction in tension was not very real. The cutthroat competition in international arena for resources, for strategically sensitive positions continued. The strategic arms limitation talks, the Cold Dawn was the famous title of the John Newhouse's book, changed to the New Cold War of John Giddings, because the Americans decided that they could not trust the Russians. The Russians were coming closer to Americans only superficially. Their system was not changing. Their economy was in a bad shape. And they needed an enemy outside. The Americans also needed that they were not exactly doing very well economically after the Cold War had reduced in tensions. So they needed tensions everywhere in the world to keep the American economy at the same exciting, pulsating rhythm as it had been during the Cold War. So the Star Wars thing started. And this is what is interesting that President Ronald Reagan, who's often criticized as a B grade actor, probably turned out to be the greatest strategist, much more than President Nixon, who was supposed to be a great expert in foreign affairs, where he imposed on Russians a space war, a Star Wars race of almost weapons coming out of the realm of science fiction, very expensive to produce, a defense shield which could not be pierced, which bankrupted the Russians and ultimately led to their decline. Now, once that happened, you had a whole lot of crises coming up all over the world. The Soviets were not going to take it lying down. So what had happened is other crises which came up in the Cold War, this phase of Cold War, the new Cold War. The Russians, the Soviets decided to intervene in Afghanistan and change this state into a communist state. They had a military intervention. They supported the Communist Party. The Communist Party had two different factions, the Khalq and the Parcham faction. We don't have to go into the details. The Soviets stayed there for almost a decade, but could not either discipline the tribals who were not used to political discipline. They could not, they remained an army of occupation, the target of Afghani tribals, and the Americans didn't want them to stay there. So, to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan, the Americans raised a crop of Taliban, and Taliban, the word literally means students, who were trained into Islamic fundamentalist creed to take on the ungodly communists in Afghanistan. They were weaponized. They were, a blind eye was turned towards the Afghan warlords who were growing opium and were indulging in the smuggling and illegal contraband trade of these opium and heroin and things of that kind. This led to a crisis right next to India's doorstep. Now, Afghanistan is a country with which India has had historic ties. Afghanistan is a country landlocked but which shares a border with Pakistan. And Pakistan has a disgruntled, dissatisfied, alienated Pakhtun minority population with which India has had age-old historic close ties. Basha Khan, Ghaffar Khan had played an important role in Indian freedom struggle, adopted the way of Gandhi, and Indian support to Pakhtuns is well known, which Pakistan thought was a support to dissidents, to weaken it, to break it. Now the point is, when Americans took on the Soviets in Afghanistan through the proxy of Taliban's, they destabilized the nation. They ruined the nation. The Taliban's, the Mujahideens kept fighting with different warlords, and there was a tug of war which till this date has not ended. And Indians, whether they like it or not, have a major challenge in Afghanistan. Now one can say that there is no Cold War in the world at the moment. But the legacy of the last phase of Cold War in Afghanistan continues to be a thorn in our flesh, because the Americans, when they move out of Afghanistan, are going to leave a place full of anarchy, a place full of lawlessness, a place full of Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, a nursery for terrorists. Is only recently they have succeeded in eliminating the son of Osama bin Laden. It was in Pakistan-Afghanistan border. Osama bin Laden himself was taking shelter in a Pakistani cantonment after hiding for us in Pakistan-Afghanistan border. So unfortunately, it is a porous border. Unfortunately, it is a disturbed border. Unfortunately, it is a border where lawlessness has prevailed. So Cold War or no Cold Once a major power moves out of that, the Indians will have a problem to contend with. So, Indians, although they have supported peace, they have supported disarmament, they cannot remain indifferent to their vital national interest. India's integrity and independence is involved not only in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, where Pakistan has been having a sponsored terroristic separatistic movement, but Afghanistan matters for us. China is also trying to pass through the Pak occupied Kashmir through the area which is of crucial importance for us to connect to the port of Gwadar. It also has been gifted the region where Aksai Chinrose has been built. So Indians will have to live with the disturbed political, economic situation and social unrest in Afghanistan. Not that we can do much about that, but we have to follow a line of foreign policy and diplomacy which looks after our interest, and we don't pay a price for protecting American interest, American withdrawal, and so on. The other impact of Cold War on India, which continues to plague us, a major headache for us, more than a headache, a festering sore, a cancer sort of, is the problem of Pakistan. Most of us think that the problem of Pakistan is restricted to the dispute of Kashmir, the land, the rivers, the water. No, it is not. The problem of Pakistan is the transformation of Pakistan very soon after its birth from a democratic nation to a military dictatorship. And this happened only because the Americans, once they realized that India under Nehru would continue unswervingly the path of non-alignment, they realized they would not get any ally in India, so it would be better to have a perpetual ally dependent on them in Pakistan. And the elected Prime Minister of Pakistan, Liaquat Ali Khan, was assassinated, and very soon after that the army coup took over power. And it has remained like that for the major part, except of a very short interregnum when Bhutto was elected as a leader of Pakistan, but was legally assassinated very soon after that. But the fact is that the transformation of a Pakistan into a military dictatorship, not only a military dictatorship but ruled by its intelligence agencies, is a direct result of American Cold War strategy. And the Americans wanted Pakistan to be an ally. Pakistan joined their SEATO and CENTO, the military alliances, and Pakistani army, because it would only get aid against India if it towed the American line, it extracted the price. So the American aircraft, the American tanks, the American weapon systems were all used against India. The Americans would keep denying it. They were given to Pakistan to be used against communists, etc. But even more disastrous has been the American raising a crop of the Talibans. Now, today the Americans can make a distinction between good Talibans and bad Talibans, but Indians can't afford to do so. And Pakistan's systematic Islamization, even it was started as an Islamic country, but fundamentalist Islamic, aggressive, Wahhabi, intolerant Islam taking roots was since the days of General Zia. General Zia himself perished in a mysterious air crash. But the interesting part is this, that when we talk that India and Pakistan are inheritors to the same shared heritage, we tend to forget that the shared heritage has eroded, and Pakistan has become a hardcore fundamentalist Islamic nation supportive of terrorists because they think that's the only way they can take revenge from India or breaking down Pakistan and Bangladesh. So Bhutto talked of following a policy of cut of 1,000 wars. This is what we are witnessing in Jammu and Kashmir. So Cold War may have been over for the Americans. Cold War may have been over for the Russians. Cold War may have been over or its overflow for the Chinese. But the fact remains that for major countries like India on the subcontinent, the lava of violence, the lava of hatred, which was generated and spilt over in the Cold War years, continues to be a major challenge for our foreign policy. Much has changed in the realm of international relations in the context of Cold War. The Cold War is now part of history. Its different phases seem to be so far back in distant past that they don't seem to affect us. But that's not true. The legacy of Cold War refuses to go away. The political map has changed. Many of the countries that had remained partitioned, divided, like the Germany, like Vietnam, have become reunited. But some countries remain partitioned, like Korea. The map has been redrawn. Pakistan broke down into two parts, and Bangladesh is a different country altogether. But then, other countries which were supposed to be unified countries have broken into smaller units. Yugoslavia has ceased to be a country. Many countries in Africa continue to fight a war of tribal, ethnic, racial kind, which is horrible, which is very cruel, but the rest of the world doesn't seem to be interested in that. The Africa, because it ceases to matter in the contest between the Americans and the Russians at the moment, is allowed to suffer horrible violence or diseases like Ebola, where nobody else in the world is worried about them because they think this has been contained in the dark continent. Whether it's the lawlessness in South Africa, whether it's lawlessness in Nigeria, whether it's piracy at the Horn of Africa, nobody seems to be worried about that. These are bits of violence, threats which can any time spill over. Like human rights are indivisible, poverty and misery too are indivisible. A poor man is desperate. A refugee ousted from his home who has lost everything has no sense of morality or law. And this is what the world has to be very cautious about. The Indians have to be very cautious about. The problem during the Cold War was that during the Vietnamese War, when peace was about to return and the war was about to end, a lot of Vietnamese people became the boat people. They boarded boats and went from one country to another country seeking shelter. Nobody was willing to receive them. They braved shark-infested seas, the typhoons, and ended up to Australia only to be turned away. Indonesians turned them away. Malaysians turned them away. And this is the same kind of a plight which the refugees from Morocco, from Africa, from Algeria are facing at the moment in Europe, or the Syrians who are desperate to reach safe havens. But the point is, India is facing an influx of refugees of its own. There are illegal refugees coming from Bangladesh into Assam in other states of Northeast India. There are refugees who are coming from Myanmar, the Rohingyas, through Bangladesh to India, and the Indian Home Minister has had to make a statement that we can't be the dustbin of all the refugees. Now, the problem is, how do we cope with this? During the Cold War, there was a consensus among members of an alliance system or people belonging to a bloc, ideological bloc, that the problem was shared. But with the weakening of the military alliance systems, fissures within an ideological bloc, it is each country for itself. And especially if you are a country which is large enough as India, people think it has its responsibility. The Americans are never tired of reminding India that India should accept responsibility in Afghanistan, commensurate with its size, commensurate with its ambitions. Now, India obviously, as we took note of, is in a position towards the end of the second decade of 20th century to assume a greater role in the region. But region means what? Region means, can we play a greater role vis-a-vis Pakistan? Obviously not. Can we play a greater role in South Asia, which is resented by our smaller neighbors in Sri Lanka or Nepal or maybe even Bangladesh? No. How long can we manage a relationship which is stress-free with Bangladesh? Past Cold War. But if Sheikh Hasina is not there, what is going to happen? Now again, if you see, Sheikh Hasina's greatest rival is Begum Khalida Zia. Now, Begum Khalida Zia's husband was again an army officer who ousted the legally elected government of a country, and also army in Bangladesh was responsible for the murder of the father of the nation, Sheikh Mujib Rahman. All this happened during the Cold War. So, the history of Cold War and the ruins of Cold War continue to haunt us. It may not haunt us to the perpetrators of Cold War, people who were responsible originally for triggering the Cold War. But the poor, helpless people who suffered during the Cold War continue to have to cope with problems generated by Cold War. And India is in an extremely difficult situation where it is to the north, there is China. To the west, one step removed from Pakistan, is Afghanistan, a hotbed of terrorism and anarchy. In the south, Sri Lanka is torn between civil strife, communal disharmony, and India itself is a nation of great variety of languages, ethnicities, regional problems, imbalances in economic development. And also when you have a strong nation pursuing a foreign policy, what earlier was a consensus is lost very easily. In Nehru's time, there was no question of somebody differing from Nehru's diplomatic initiatives or his foreign policy formulations. All of them did not succeed very well. Mrs. Gandhi, at the height of her power, could take a decision, and she was lauded in the parliament by her arch opponent like Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who compared her with goddess Durga. But Mr. Modi, as a prime minister, has to face with an opposition which is going to find fault with his definition of national interest, his prioritization of national interest, the way he implements national interest. Now, if you see the changes brought about by India in the administrative structure of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, reducing it in its status, making it a union territory to be administered directly by the central government, was an attempt to take advantage when China is busy in Hong Kong. China is struggling to tell the world that it should not interfere because Hong Kong is its own internal affair. Obviously, China cannot, supporting Pakistan, say that India doesn't have a right to protect its sovereignty and integrity in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. It is an internal matter. And especially if the Indian foreign minister has made it clear to China that these changes do not affect either the international border or the line of actual control. So, like in Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Chinese could not be assured of Russian support, Soviet support, but Indians could not also be as adequately supported by the Russians because they were busy in Cuban Missile Crisis. So in international politics, every actor tries to take advantage of a crisis to get something else somewhere else. At the moment, Donald Trump is very worried about how the impact of the trade war with China will take place. He has not been able to pull a dramatic success either in a peace agreement with North Koreans, nor has he been able to contain the Iranian ambitions to continue with their nuclear enrichment and cope with the embargoes put against them. He doesn't know how to deal with Putin, who's hard-headed, who's combative, and who doesn't have a conciliatory bone in his body, if one might use the metaphor. Now the point is, Modi took advantage of all these unfortunately critical developments in the immediate international environment, but favorable to Indian pursuit of national interest. Americans were busy in Syria and Iraq. Americans were stuck in Russia. Americans were busy about what was happening in China. China was busy in Hong Kong. China was also being given pinpricks by Uyghurs in Turkmenistan. And Indians could do something which cannot be undone in a hurry later on. That's one part of the thing. There are other things. European Union itself is on a brink of a breakdown. The Brexit has put great stress on it. Europeans, who are normally custodians of the human rights all over the world, could not more than make token ritual statements about what was happening, the changes in Jammu and Kashmir. So this again is a skill which somebody who has the memories of Cold War can use to one's advantage. The Indians at the moment seem to have learned the lessons of the past rather well. They are aware of the complexity of the challenges they are facing, but it remains that there is no consensus, no all-party consensus on the foreign policy priorities of India at the moment. Mr. Modi has succeeded greatly ever since he became a Prime Minister in exploring and exploiting, developing the options. India has a strategic partnership with Russia. It has a strategic partnership with Japan. It has a strategic partnership with America. It has very good relationship with Israel. So obviously, it cannot have the same kind of proximity closeness with the Palestinians and the Arabs, but the Americans have not left the space for the Indians at all. In Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Libya, the Americans have taken over. So the Indians are doing the best they can under the circumstances. What needs to be underlined most of all is the fact that countries like India, regional powers, emerging powers, middle powers of significance, have to realize that in the post-Cold War world, there is no scope of having a united front against one bloc or the other, or carving out a space outside the contest for itself. The Afro-Asian solidarity has been lost forever. The African continent has been cordoned off. The Latin America, whether it is Brazil or Argentina or Chile or Venezuela or Central America like Mexico, are not in a position to assert their independence and solidarity with a country like India. The geographical distance is much too great also. The most important change that has happened since the Cold War, and partly towards the end of the years of Cold War, is when the Americans used religion as an instrument to weaken the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It is boomeranged. Now there is a form of aggressive fundamentalist Islam which has transformed the Islamic world. Now the Americans are in a position to control the politics of oil in Iran and Iraq and Libya and Saudi Arabia, and they are very happy that as long as their homeland is not attacked by terrorists, and they have not suffered another attack since 9/11, and 9/11 was the only attack they suffered after the Pearl Harbor on their mainland, there is no chance of a